how do we play the music? Or emphasis on rhythm when we're talking about the Black environment, very much part of the whole jazz scene
Mhm.
and whatnot. And then how do we juxtapose that against the Jewish community? What do they listen to? How do they listen to? How do the radios sound? All of these like little clues, which could then be things that we jump off when we do stuff that's subjective, right?
Hi, I'm Gordon Brickell from Filmmaker U, a site for industry professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com or, of course, follow us on Instagram at filmmaker_u. Every week, we interview a film professional to discuss their work, and this week I'm joined by sound designer, re-recording mixer, and score mixer, Dror Mohar, whose work includes The Greatest Showman, Kandahar, and more recently, Lady in the Lake for Apple TV+. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I guess my first question for you is what attracted you to the show Lady in the Lake?
Um, well, I worked with director Alma Har'el before,
Mhm.
previously to the show, and we reconnected randomly. We were both traveling and reconnected. And she told me about the show, and she was super excited about it. And just actually hearing her passion and her excitement for the project was like, the big turn on. Whenever you get with someone and they are that amped about what they're doing,
Mhm.
it's a great sign because filmmaking is it's a process that's multi-layered and can get very heavy, very loaded as time goes on. And so when people keep that level of excitement up, it's always a big turn on.
I got into sound designing at a point when things were just developing. I was really fascinated by the idea that dialogue, effects, and music were all components of the soundtrack to a film, which had never occurred to me before. What gets me excited is coming up with sound ideas that do match picture, but also is not just the equivalent of what you're seeing on screen. I'm Eugene Garrity, and this is my course on sound design.
So, what were some of the discussions about the vision for sound in this film when you came on early?
Well, so actually, to put things in context, I actually came in late in the
Okay.
project. They had already gotten started, and there was a team in place, and there were people that were working on, and the project had extended for different reasons. They
Mhm.
were putting more work into it and going deeper into it, and they just wanted, another, set of ears and, creative person on board. And I think from the very beginning, uh, Alma's um, Alma's approach in general, but specifically here, was to kind of go between the internal world of our characters and specifically their identity and what motivated them and how life affected them back in kind of like, racial 60s era and community that they
Mhm.
were, where they were at that point in time, and how that manifested in reality.
Mhm.
Um, so a lot of it, like, how do we make sound do that for us? How do we put these clues in, so that so that we can kind of complement the screen, complement what's happening on the screen with sound, and so a lot of it was that.
Okay. So, how did you do that? Do that to sort of complement the era and sort of leave clues.
I think that a lot of it had to do with, so we're talking, to put things in perspective, we're talking about Detroit,
Hmm.
right? And we've got these things that are happening between the Black minority at that time, and also like the white but also Jewish minority at that time,
Hmm.
uh, which are both in a way minorities. Um, and so a lot of that had to do with trying to pick out sounds that were true to the time, in terms
Hmm.
of like how vehicles sound? How did the music sound? How did doors sound? How did, simple things that actually give us the sense of technology and movement and aesthetics of the world around us. And also things that had to do basically with their own like cultures, like how for, African Americans, how did things sound to their ears?
Hmm.
How was the environment for them? You know, how was the environment for the Jewish people? How did they speak? How did, you know what I mean? So it
Hmm.
was kind of like that in terms of making maybe things, like how do we play the music, for instance?
Hmm.
Is it a little bit more gritty and a little bit more emphasis on rhythm when we're talking about the Black environment, which was very much part of the whole jazz scene
Hmm.
and whatnot?
Well,
And
in
is it a
Motown, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
and then how do we basically juxtapose that against the Jewish community? What do they listen to? How do they listen to? How do the radios sound? All of these like little clues, which could then be things that we jump off when we do stuff that's subjective, right? So if we have a scene where there's music playing, and then we kind of want to transition for a second to be in their head, then how do we transition in terms of these elements? How do maybe we reverb them out? Maybe we dull them a little bit. Which elements do we do that with to kind of still leave that internal world to keep
Hmm.
that so we connect it to the character and where they are in the scene, and yet be able to let their thoughts, or their emotions kind of bloom.
How did the story, or how did, sorry, the sound change as the story arc and the character arcs sort of evolved through the series?
Um, I think that in the big, so the series, it's a really great question, actually. Thank you. Uh,
Hmm.
so the series is kind of like, on its face, it's a murder mystery. And at
Hmm.
the same time, it's a story of um, class and race in America, right? In Detroit at that time. Um, and as we get deeper and deeper into the series, we understand how that reality for these two groups of people, how that affected their lives and what that meant in terms of the murder mystery.
Hmm.
So we start with things that are a little bit more maybe organic or more straightforward. And I think that as things progressed, we got a little bit more intense with the sound. And that didn't necessarily mean that it was stronger or gritty or whatever. I think that together, the entire team, we took a little bit more liberty and a little bit more risks in making things maybe even a bit softer, than we had originally, not just necessarily louder or bigger or better.
Hmm.
And perhaps maybe take the opportunity to punctuate certain things a little bit more than we had in the beginning. So to say that in the beginning we were representing reality a little bit more naturally, and as things grew, that reality just got a little bit more intense.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally. It made me think about the dock scene where there's
Yeah.
all these different flashbacks, and I'm wondering
Mm.
like how you dealt with each of these different flashbacks and creating sort of that raw emotional feeling of the flashbacks.
Yeah. It's a good one. It's actually that's my favorite scene. And it's my favorite because my favorite thing on every project is actually the people,
Hmm.
right? Like the making of the films, the making of is everything.
Hmm.
And what was special about that is that we had worked really hard on that scene prior to coming to stage. And when we got to stage, something wasn't hitting the spot for the filmmakers. For I think we all felt that it was good, but it wasn't as great as we wanted it to be. And sometimes often you'll meet that on stage where as you shape things, the shape of what comes before affects obviously what comes after. And we got into that and it felt like it didn't hold the kind of energy that we wanted it to hold. It didn't take us as deep and it wasn't as intense or whatnot. Anyway, it just wasn't hitting. And we ended up recreating all of that on stage. So at the mix stage, it was just like, okay, let's go back to basics. And we literally like did a delete on the entire session. We said, okay, let's stop people. We've got to do some editing here. And we just literally looked at the scene and went back to kind of theoretically like, okay, what's the script? What is the journey that she's going to have to go through? What are the best sounds that both complement the images that we're seeing and also communicate her experience of those images, both at the time and what it means now? And then we went back to different scenes that we had already visited in the film, so the audience were familiar with those scenes, and we took those sounds and we took only those specific sounds that motivated those memories. So, for instance, like there was a sound of the trains that were very specific to where she had grown up, right? So it was very specific to her environment, growing up kind of like in a poorer area.
Yeah.
And we only hear those trains there. So it immediately transported us there. And that's what we needed, right? We needed like and which is a pet peeve of mine, like a single sound that says everything, right? Of course. But so it's like, great, we want her to be a child again. Let's bring up that train and she's a child again, immediately. And then there's in that same instance, it's this conversation with her dad. So it's taking a little bit of her voice and maybe a whistle, right? And then it's basically going back to a dream that she had. So what was there in the dream that's important? And maybe some of it was like the wind and the sheet that falls. And when we say that, initially it's like, well, wind and sheet doesn't necessarily sound like that great of an interesting sound, but it's a very visceral thing. We all know what wind makes us feel like, and what a sheet feels like. So it's actually a very valuable tool in terms of transporting the audience. So it was really hand selecting those elements. Less is more, kind of like put it up. Does it stick? Great, leave it. Let's put these things up. And now let's see how they work when we play it back long form. And then we just kept going the scene over and over and adding a little bit at a time, treating them as they need to be against the music until it felt just right.
Curious about creating high-quality YouTube videos? Enroll in video editing and production classes at Manhattan Edit Workshop to sharpen your skills and turn a hobby into a career. Start your journey to becoming a pro today.
So how many tracks then did you end up with if you're going through and adding all these?
Actually, it was actually less than I would imagine. Yeah. I think at the end it didn't end up being that many tracks, maybe.
Okay.
I don't know, maybe 10, 20.
Okay. Yeah.
10, 20 in the session that sometimes I had excess of 500, right?
Yeah.
But that's, it's easy to do when you've got everything already shaped. So
interesting. Now, one of the things I when I was reading up about this is Alma continuously sort of changed or evolved the sound design during post, and like that can be tricky if you're setting out to design something and then it's like, okay, we got to start over again. So how did the sound, what was the original plan, and then how did it evolve or change over the course of the show?
Yeah. I think that, having worked with Alma in the past, I I know how she works, and that's how Alma is. Alma uses all the components that make up a film at once, all the time, and ever evolving.
Hmm.
So with filmmakers, the job is obviously to put them in a position to empower their creativity, give them the tools so they can um, identify what it is that uh, they feel motivates and captures their vision.
Hmm.
And for different filmmakers, that's a different thing. I say that because for Alma specifically, it's not just about sound, it's enabling her process, which is like to give her a lot of source material to
Hmm.
work with during the editorial process and allow her to mold that, get it back from her, and use that the next jumping point. You know,
Hmm.
does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like I'd a lot of times we'd receive a scene and I'd look at it and I'd make some notes and then we'd talk it over and I'd get, okay, here's where you want to go. And I'll make a pass, crude pass of like,
Hmm.
okay, here are like 10 pieces of sound that I feel really hit the mark. Give her a pack of those sounds with
Hmm.
some variations and let her use that in the cut with her editor. And then she'll give it back to me and goes like, okay, here's how we used it, or here's what I liked and here's what I didn't like. And then I jump off that and make another version of that,
Hmm.
you know? And sometimes sometimes it was as successful as how I just described, to mean that she'd use it and I'd get it back and it was great and we keep evolving. And sometimes it was just like, no, I didn't like any of it, you know, and it's cool. So
Hmm.
we go back to the drawing board. And so ultimately, knowing that coming in, it wasn't like as in a traditional sense that r- looked at things in a very kind of linear fashion where like, okay,
Yeah.
now we would do this, now we would have this, and this scene would be set, and all these elements would be ready for the mix, and then we'd go mix them. It was always like we're evolving the palette of sounds, our cabinet of tricks and tools and
Yeah.
paints and brushes that we like. And then we're going to come to stage and they will be in sync with the picture. And we'll keep choreographing them all the way through the mix. That's how it worked. So knowing that coming in, um, it was easy.
Yeah.
Not that it was creatively not challenging, but it wasn't difficult. I
Yeah.
expected it.
Because you mentioned working with the editor and like sort of sending off the sounds, how much of, of the final sort of series were you able to sort of give off to the editor so that when it came back to you, you weren't having to script, clear out everything and start from scratch again? Like how much were you able to sort of help them build in the edit to continue in the sound?
Oh, I think all of us did that to a
Hmm.
really great extent. Yeah, not
Okay.
just myself, but
Yeah.
everybody on every team. But on my end, on the sound end, on visual effects scene, we were constantly feeding them things and
Hmm.
seeing that reflected in the cut, or sometimes not. But the communication was there to
Yeah.
enough to help us understand where they were at. So by the time we got to stage, there weren't any real surprises.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I have one last question for you. What would you say is your favorite guilty pleasure film or TV show to watch?
Before, yeah, I
Yeah.
thought that was it caught me by surprise. I wasn't expecting it, and I thought that some of the filmmaking there was just
Yeah.
phenomenal, just phenomenal. Like the
Yeah.
writing was great, and the acting was great, and obviously the sound and everything was great. But it was just, I remember the last episode in the theater. I was just like, wow,
Yeah.
that was a huge accomplishment. I loved it.
Well, thank you so much for letting me interview you today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Had a great
And
time.
you too. And that's it for this week, everyone. Make sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com or, of course, on Instagram at filmmaker_u. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching.